The war did not end in Poland when the guns fell silent. It only learned how to whisper. Long after the roar of artillery faded and flags were raised in victory, something restless remained beneath the soil, unmarked, unnamed, and unanswered. In churchyards and forgotten corners of towns rebuilt from rubble, the dead waited without crosses. Some were soldiers, some were civilians, and some were women whose lives had been devoted not to nations or armies, but to mercy. They were nurses. They were nuns. And for more than 75 years, no one spoke their names aloud. In the winter and spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and the Red Army pushed westward through East Prussia and northern Poland, villages emptied, roads clogged with refugees, and the rules of the old world dissolved. Liberation arrived hand in hand with terror. For many civilians, especially women, the uniforms that promised freedom also brought violence. Near the towns of Orneta and Gdańsk, 7 members of the Order of St. Catherine of Alexandria were serving where the need was greatest: makeshift hospitals, convent infirmaries, and refugee shelters filled with the wounded and dying. They wore habits instead of weapons. Their only allegiance was to care. They never left those places alive. What happened to them would not appear in official histories. There were no trials, no photographs, no graves marked with dates or names. Their stories survived only as fragments, whispered testimonies, half-remembered rumors, and burial maps folded and hidden away as the world rushed forward. And then, decades later, the ground began to speak. In 1945, northern Poland was a land in collapse. The region around Orneta, then part of East Prussia, changed hands violently as Soviet forces advanced. German civilians fled west. Polish communities prepared to reclaim lands that had been German for generations. Churches were damaged, records burned, and cemeteries disturbed. In this chaos, death was everywhere, and burial became a matter of urgency rather than dignity. The Sisters of St. Catherine had been there long before the final battles. Founded centuries earlier, the order had a long tradition of medical service. By the end of the war, many sisters were functioning as nurses, tending to soldiers from both sides and civilians alike. Their convents were often converted into emergency hospitals. The sisters stayed when others fled. Witnesses would later say that the sisters believed their vows protected them, that no one would harm women who healed the wounded and prayed over the dying. History proved otherwise. When Soviet troops entered the area, violence erupted almost immediately. Looting, assaults, and executions were common across the region. Religious institutions were not spared. In some cases, they were targeted. According to testimonies gathered years later, groups of Red Army soldiers entered convent grounds near Orneta and later near Gdańsk. The sisters were confronted, interrogated, and abused. What followed was systematic brutality: rape, torture, and murder carried out over hours or days. Some sisters attempted to resist. Others prayed. None were spared. Their deaths were not individual acts of rage. They were group killings, multiple victims murdered together, their identities blurred into a single, silent crime. When it was over, the bodies were not honored. They were wrapped hastily or left exposed. Local civilians, terrified and powerless, buried them quickly in nearby cemeteries or unmarked plots. Names were not written down. Crosses were temporary or never placed. The priority was survival, not memory. And as borders shifted and regimes changed, even those fragile memories were buried. After the war, Poland entered a new era under Soviet influence. Discussing crimes committed by Soviet soldiers was dangerous. Many witnesses stayed silent. Church archives were monitored. Entire communities learned to forget in public, even if they remembered in private. The Order of St. Catherine knew some sisters had vanished. Letters went unanswered. Convents waited for women who never returned. But there were no bodies, no confirmed deaths, and no official acknowledgement. Over time, the missing were listed as lost during the war, a phrase so common it meant almost nothing. Generations passed. The convents rebuilt, towns grew, cemeteries were reorganized, graves were moved, reused, or erased. Children played where the dead lay beneath the grass. Yet fragments endured. In parish files, a hand-drawn cemetery map was preserved, folded, fragile, and annotated in pencil. It showed unusual markings, graves without names, and a note that read simply, "Sisters, 1945." In another archive, a brief wartime report mentioned religious nurses killed by soldiers with no further detail. In oral histories recorded decades later, elderly residents spoke hesitantly of the nuns who never came back, lowering their voices even after the fall of communism. For years, these fragments were not enough. They suggested a tragedy but not proof. Then archaeology entered the story. In the late 2010s, Polish researchers began a systematic effort to locate forgotten wartime graves. Advances in forensic science, combined with renewed access to archives, made it possible to investigate cases long considered unsolvable. Near Gdańsk, attention turned to an old cemetery whose layout did not match official records. Using wartime burial plans, ground-penetrating radar, and careful excavation, archaeologists uncovered human remains buried in a manner inconsistent with standard graves. 4 sets of remains were found together. They were women. They had signs of violent trauma. They were buried without personal markers. Forensic analysis revealed fractures, gunshot wounds, and evidence consistent with sexual violence. Clothing fragments indicated religious garments, buttons, fabric remnants, and rosary pieces that had survived underground for decades. DNA testing followed. Comparisons were made with living relatives of the order, descendants of siblings, nieces, and nephews. Records from convent archives were cross-referenced with forensic data. Slowly, identities emerged. In 2020, the confirmation came. 4 of the 7 missing sisters of St. Catherine had been found in Gdańsk. They had names again. But the story was not finished. Later that same year, investigators turned their attention inland, near Olsztyn. Another cemetery, another burial map, another quiet patch of ground long assumed to hold nothing unusual. 3 more bodies were discovered. The same pattern appeared: female remains, religious artifacts, signs of execution and abuse. DNA analysis confirmed what many had feared and hoped for at the same time. All 7 sisters were now accounted for. 75 years after their murder, the dead were finally identified. The announcement was brief: no dramatic press conference, no international outrage, just a statement acknowledging that 7 nuns, murdered in 1945, had been located and confirmed through archaeological and forensic work. For the Order of St. Catherine, it was closure long delayed. For historians, it was proof of what survivors had whispered for decades. For the land itself, it was an unburdening. But beneath the relief lay a deeper discomfort. Because these women were not alone. Their case echoed patterns seen across Europe at the end of World War II: group targeting during chaotic transitions, crimes committed by victorious forces, and truths buried under political necessity. Religious women, nurses, and caregivers were particularly vulnerable. They were visible, unarmed, and symbolically powerful. Many similar cases were never documented. Some remain undiscovered. Others were erased entirely. What made this case different was not the violence, but the patience, the willingness to wait decades for evidence, the refusal to let silence become truth. When the sisters were finally reburied with full rites, bells rang in towns that had not existed in their current form when the women died. New generations attended ceremonies for victims they had never known. The past intruded gently but firmly into the present. And still questions remained. Who exactly killed them? Were orders given, or was this chaos unchecked? How many similar graves still lie undiscovered beneath European soil? The sisters had been found. Justice, however, was another matter. The war had ended in 1945. But for these 7 women, the reckoning had only just begun. The sisters were buried again under clean earth, under crosses carved with their real names at last. The ceremonies were quiet, almost restrained, as if Poland itself feared speaking too loudly about what had happened. There were no accusations shouted, no demands for trials that could never come. The men who killed them were almost certainly dead themselves, scattered into the anonymity of history. Justice in its traditional sense was impossible. But memory had returned, and memory can be dangerous. Because once these 7 women were acknowledged, a door opened that many preferred to keep closed. Historians, clergy, and forensic investigators understood immediately that this case did not stand alone. The murder of the 7 sisters of St. Catherine fit a pattern long whispered about but rarely examined openly. The targeting of religious women during the chaotic advance of armies in 1944 and 1945, especially in territories where authority collapsed overnight. The end of the war was not a single moment. It was a slow tearing away of order. And in that tearing, some people learned how easily violence could hide. In early 1945, the Red Army moved fast. Entire towns were overtaken in hours. Soldiers were exhausted, traumatized, and fueled by propaganda that painted enemy territory as a place where vengeance was permitted. Discipline varied wildly between units. Officers sometimes tried to maintain control. Often, they failed or chose not to intervene. Religious institutions were especially exposed. Convents were fixed locations. They did not evacuate easily. The sisters believed their neutrality protected them. They treated wounded German soldiers, Soviet prisoners, civilians of all backgrounds. To the sisters, suffering erased nationality. To some soldiers, it did not. Witness accounts collected decades later described soldiers mocking religious symbols, tearing habits, and accusing nuns of collaboration simply because they were present during German occupation. The sisters' vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, offered no shield against men who saw uniforms as proof of power. What made the murders near Ornetta and Gdańsk particularly chilling was their collective nature. These were not isolated acts committed by a lone individual. The sisters were attacked as a group, held together, assaulted together, and killed together. The crime was communal, normalized within the unit that committed it. And that, historians would later argue, is what allowed it to disappear so completely. Group crimes vanish more easily than individual ones. After the first 4 bodies were identified in Gdańsk, archivists returned to boxes untouched for decades. Parish logs, Red Cross notes, convent correspondence, all were re-examined with new urgency. Suddenly, entries once dismissed as vague became significant. One letter, written in trembling handwriting, described the sisters taken by soldiers and ended abruptly. Another recorded that the nurses did not return after the army arrived. These documents had existed all along. What had changed was the willingness to read them without fear. During the communist period, such material was politically dangerous. Accusing Soviet forces of war crimes could lead to surveillance, job loss, or worse. Entire families learned to bury their knowledge deep, passing it down only in fragments, often stripped of detail. Now, witnesses who had been children in 1945 were elderly. Some came forward, driven by the knowledge that time was nearly gone. Their testimonies were cautious but consistent. They remembered screams from behind convent walls. They remembered trucks leaving at night. They remembered being told never to speak of it again. None had been able to help. Forensic analysis added another layer to the story. one that words alone could not convey. The skeletal remains told of close-range executions. Some skulls bore bullet wounds from pistols, not rifles. Bones showed fractures inflicted before death. There were signs of restraint. The injuries were not battlefield casualties. They were intimate, deliberate acts. Pathologists were careful in their language, but the conclusion was unavoidable. The sisters had been abused before they were killed. This detail was especially painful for the Order of St. Catherine. The sisters' vows of chastity had been violated in the most violent way possible. Yet the order insisted that this truth be acknowledged, not hidden. Silence, they argued, had already done enough damage. When the findings were made public, reactions were divided. Some praised the honesty. Others argued that reopening such wounds served no purpose. A few voices, quiet but present, warned against politicizing history. But the dead were already political. They always had been. The identification of the final 3 sisters in Olsztyn closed the physical mystery, but expanded the moral one. Why had their burial sites been separated? Research suggested that the sisters were murdered in 2 locations, days apart, as Soviet units moved through the region. Some were killed near their convent. Others were transported elsewhere, possibly after surviving the initial assault, before being executed. This possibility haunted investigators. It suggested fear, captivity, waiting. It suggested that some of the sisters may have known what was coming. No diaries survived to confirm it. No final letters were found. But the forensic timeline implied suffering stretched across days, not moments. This realization changed how the case was understood. It was no longer a single atrocity, but a sequence of decisions, each one a chance to stop, each one ignored. As news of the discovery spread beyond Poland, similar stories resurfaced across Eastern Europe. In Hungary, Slovakia, the Baltics, reports emerged of nuns assaulted and killed in 1945, often buried without markers. Some had never been investigated. Others were dismissed as unverified. A few had been quietly acknowledged by the Church but never examined scientifically. The case of the 7 sisters became a reference point, proof that these stories were not myths or exaggerations, but documented crimes waiting for recognition. Scholars began to frame these events within a broader pattern: violence against religious women during transitional chaos, enabled by power imbalance and silence. Unlike priests, whose deaths were sometimes recorded, nuns were often invisible, women without families of their own, easily erased from official narratives. They served. They disappeared. And history moved on. Until now. For the Order of St. Catherine, the return of the sisters' names had profound spiritual significance. Memorial services were held not only as funerals, but as acts of restoration. The sisters were spoken of not as victims alone, but as witnesses, women who remained in service even as the world collapsed around them. The Church stopped short of declaring martyrdom in the formal sense. The complexity of the crime, sexual violence, political context, lack of clear ideological motive, made such classification difficult. Yet many within the order believed the sisters had died because of who they were and what they represented. Women of faith, caregivers, symbols of mercy in a time of vengeance. That was enough. And still the ground remains unsettled. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of wartime graves across Poland alone remain undocumented. Many belong to civilians killed during evacuations, reprisals, or lawless transitions. Some contain victims whose stories will never be reconstructed. The difference is that now, the silence feels temporary. Every excavation risks reopening old fears, but also offers a chance to replace rumor with truth. The sisters' case has become a model: patient research, careful forensics, and respect for the dead over political comfort. Not every case will end with names restored, but some will. And each one challenges the idea that history is finished. The war taught the world how quickly humanity can collapse. The decades after taught it how long denial can last. For 75 years, 7 women lay beneath Polish soil without acknowledgement, their lives reduced to missing entries in convent logs, their deaths absorbed into the background noise of a brutal century. But the earth remembered. And when it finally spoke, it told a story not just about murder, but about endurance, about truth delayed, not denied forever, about the cost of silence and the quiet power of numbing the dead. The sisters did not survive the war, but their story did. And somewhere beneath fields and churchyards still unexplored, other stories are waiting, patiently, for the moment when someone decides to listen. Silence is not empty. It is crowded with what people are afraid to say. For decades after 1945, the story of the 7 Sisters of St. Catherine existed only in that crowded silence. It lived in the way older women crossed themselves when passing certain cemeteries, in the way conversations stopped when the Red Army was mentioned, in the way convent records listed names without endings, no date of death, no place, just absence. Absence became a kind of truth. Children grew up hearing fragments without context. Something bad happened. They were taken. Do not ask questions. And so the questions waited, accumulating weight year after year, until the people who remembered the answers were nearly gone. By the time forensic teams began their work in earnest, the witnesses were in their 80s and 90s. Many agreed to speak only after the remains were found, as if the earth itself had given permission. What they described was not chaos, but a pattern. In January 1945, when Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Orneta, the town was already hollowed out by fear. German administration had collapsed. Polish civilians remained uncertain whether liberation would mean safety or further violence. The convent where the sisters worked had become a refuge, beds lined with wounded civilians, refugees sleeping on floors, sisters working without rest. When the soldiers arrived, they came first as patients. The sisters treated them, cleaned wounds, offered water. They did not ask where the men had come from or what they had done. Pain erased uniforms. Suffering made everyone equal. This, some witnesses believed, was what sealed their fate. To certain soldiers, kindness from religious women felt like judgment, like mockery, like a reminder of something they had lost or never had. Alcohol circulated freely. Discipline eroded. Authority became a suggestion rather than a rule. That night, armed men returned to the convent. They did not come for medical care. The testimonies that survived are fractured, but together they form a horrifying sequence. Doors forced open. Habits torn. Icons smashed against walls. The sisters were accused of hiding Germans, of spying, of refusing to cooperate, accusations that shifted moment to moment, never meant to be proven. Violence escalated quickly, fueled by power and impunity. Some sisters tried to shield others. One reportedly stood between soldiers and a younger nun, only to be struck down. Another was dragged away screaming prayers until her voice disappeared into the night. Neighbors heard cries but did not intervene. To step outside was to risk death. Survival required stillness. By morning, the convent was silent. The sisters were gone. In the days that followed, bodies began to appear, some near the convent, others miles away. Local civilians, terrified and uncertain who now held authority, did what they could. They buried the dead quickly, often at night, often without clergy, sometimes without even knowing the names of the women they were lowering into the ground. Someone drew maps, someone marked locations, someone hoped these notes would matter someday. Then life demanded attention again. The war continued west, borders shifted, New governments took control. Those maps were folded and hidden. What could not be hidden was the psychological damage. Survivors carried guilt like a second spine. We heard them, we did nothing, we lived. For many, silence became penance. When the remains were finally examined in the 21st century, forensic specialists encountered something they had learned to recognize in mass atrocity cases: evidence of systematic dehumanization. The sisters' personal items were scattered or destroyed, rosaries broken, religious medals bent or snapped. These were not random acts. They were symbolic, an attempt to erase identity before erasing life. One forensic anthropologist later remarked that the violence suggested rage directed not only at individuals, but at what they represented: faith, compassion, moral restraint. In other words, witnesses to humanity. The discoveries in Gdańsk and Olsztyn triggered an unexpected reaction among younger generations. Students visited the reburial sites. Journalists asked uncomfortable questions. Documentary filmmakers began tracing similar cases. What had once been considered too old or too sensitive suddenly felt urgent. Why had these crimes remained unacknowledged for so long? Why were some war narratives preserved while others were suppressed? Who decides which victims matter? The sisters' story cut across political lines. It challenged the simplified idea of liberation without denying the horrors of Nazi occupation. It forced a reckoning with the truth that suffering did not end when one uniform replaced another. For some, this complexity was unsettling. But history rarely fits clean moral shapes. The Catholic Church faced its own reckoning. For years, the Church had known fragments of the story but lacked proof. Now, with forensic confirmation, pressure grew to formally recognize the sisters' deaths, not as propaganda, not as accusation, but as truth. The Church emphasized that remembering the sisters was not about assigning collective guilt. It was about honoring victims whose humanity had been denied twice, first by their killers, then by silence. Memorial plaques were installed. Names were spoken aloud during Mass. The sisters were woven back into the history of their order, no longer footnotes, no longer mysteries. They were real again. Yet even as the case reached its emotional conclusion, investigators were uneasy. Because the sisters' graves had been found not because they were unique, but because someone had kept records. How many others had no maps? No witnesses left alive. No DNA relatives to compare. The sisters represented the visible tip of something vast and mostly invisible. Across Europe, especially in regions that changed hands violently, mass graves remain unexamined. Some contain soldiers, some contain civilians, some contain women whose only crime was being present when power changed. The end of World War II is often remembered as a moment of relief. But for many, it was a season of lawlessness, a time when revenge blurred into atrocity and accountability dissolved into politics. The sisters died in that blur. In interviews conducted after the discoveries, members of the Order of St. Catherine spoke quietly about forgiveness, not because the crimes were small, but because hatred would only extend the violence forward in time. Forgiveness, they said, did not mean forgetting. It meant remembering without becoming what destroyed them. This stance unsettled some observers. They wanted anger, they wanted condemnation, they wanted villains clearly named. But the sisters' legacy resisted simplification. They had lived without hatred. They had died without weapons. And now, even in memory, they refused to become instruments of division. 75 years after their deaths, the sisters were finally laid to rest with dignity. Bells rang, candles burned, soil was returned gently to the ground. But the most important change was invisible. The silence that once surrounded their story was broken. Not by shouting, not by accusation, but by truth. Their case stands now as a warning and a testament. A warning of what happens when power goes unchecked, when victory excuses cruelty, when victims are inconvenient to remember. And a testament to patience, that even after decades, even after witnesses die and borders change, the earth can still give up its secrets. The sisters were not forgotten. They were waiting. Waiting for someone to listen. Waiting for someone to dig. Waiting for someone to care enough to ask why unnamed graves existed in peaceful places. Now their names are known. Their story is told. And their lives, once erased, have become a quiet accusation against every age that chooses comfort over truth. The war ended in 1945. But for 7 women buried without names, it did not truly end until the moment their bones saw daylight again. And even now, as grass grows back over their graves and ceremonies fade into memory, their story carries a final, unsettling question, one that reaches far beyond Poland, far beyond religion, far beyond one war. How many other voices are still buried, waiting for the ground to speak?